What if, somewhere far off, in a land of birds and blue check marks, of shitposts and people who seem like they're shitposting, but oh my god, you actually think that, don't you? There were groups of people who argued about whether or not a vague concept of a wizard was actually reflective of how the universe came into being. And what if one of these people in these groups were accused of not understanding the moral argument, as though there's just one, because the person he was talking to was saying that the idea that morality is based in the worth of a human being, which is only able to be given by God, was like not wrong in like a bunch of ways. So he made a podcast episode about this argument he had in Birdland. Welcome to the Apostate's Playground. I am Phineas 12 Gauge, and this is an episode about a Twitter fight I had. And the next episode will be about why smart people who, on principle, agree with the person that I had the Twitter fight with also kind of disagree with them. But this is going to be kind of a long episode. I don't want to take too much longer. Like all good Twitter arguments, it started with a theist telling me what it would mean if my atheist morality was true. I didn't know this person. I don't know this person. They don't know me or what my atheist morality is, or that that's a meaningless sentiment. They just knew what their favorite pastor or favorite YouTube evangelist had said. They told me that according to atheist morality, it's okay for me to put my penis anywhere as long as everybody consents, and that's good so far. But they then went on to say that you can fuck horses and cows and corpses or whatever else as long as nobody says no. And since they can't say no, the atheist morality says that that's a perfectly moral thing, which, no, that's gross and bad. I responded to this by saying that consent isn't not saying no. Consent is based in the ability to understand what is happening to you on the same level as the other person is able to understand it, be able to say no without repercussion, and to have it be respected when you do say no. That anybody who doesn't think those are all important is dangerous, and that atheists who may have said otherwise are just wrong. They need to update their definition of consent, and they don't represent me, because the closest I get to an atheist who represents me is dead. So take that, your beliefs. And this is an important way to define consent. It covers power differential because that affects your ability to say no without repercussion. If you say no to X celebrity, if you speak up, then you can get death threats, you can get harassed, you can mildly impact their career, get them sentenced to 10 years for rape, but released in 2 because the last DA made a pinky promise no rapesies deal in the form of a press conference saying that he was using his prosecutorial discretion. It also covers the ability to say, hey, I'm not having sex with you, boss, because when you do that, there is the possibility that there's going to be repercussions. So that affects that power dynamic of you feeling like you're able to. It also covers various classes of non-speaking objects, your horses, your dogs, your corpses. So that's good, covers things that have or had various levels of awareness and sentience, but aren't able to say yes or no for various reasons of animal or deadness, which is a big concern for Christians. Are atheists morally allowed to fuck corpses? It also, just for the sake of argument, really locks down the whole necrophilia argument, because I do see that come up quite a bit, especially on the social medias, as like this is a thing that is an inescapable trap for your atheist morality, but making it so that they can say no and consent is something that can be revoked is a good way to argue against that, because if you ever end up with, what if the person said yes while they're alive? Well, they can't revoke consent, which means it's not good enough.
Although, frankly, I do have some very serious concerns about you if your big issue with morality is whether or not it can help you win fights on social media rather than just being a good person.
So that led to an argument that's based more or less on whether or not humans have value. The interlocutor jumped to saying that it doesn't matter anyway, because if God isn't real, all atheist morality is just based on opinion, and feelings and facts don't care about your opinions. So I want to tackle 3 things here. The first is the fact that facts and feelings are actually intrinsically related. Not only do facts care about your feelings, feelings care about facts, and feelings help influence what you see as fact. So I want to tackle that bullshit. The second is the argument that she was trying to make, and the last is the moral arguments for the existence of God as philosophers talk about them. So this episode is inspired at least a little bit by a Twitter fight that I had, but the moral arguments for God's existence on a philosophical level are something that atheists should be at least passingly familiar with. And if there's one thing I can say honestly about this podcast, it's that it has a passing familiarity with things. And I want to do this without saying that God is just a feeling you have or whatever. I don't find that compelling. The exception is one time, sort of, I'm going to do that. I tend to find it more useful to assume actual piety, and that the theist that I'm talking to believes in God as an actual being separate from themselves and not based in opinion or feeling at all, but something that they see in as being the same as like air. And if you remember the bit about God models and Sally McFaig, that's how she saw the immanent aspect of God, was something similar to air. So I want to avoid the idea that God is just based in feeling and indoctrination and approach it a little differently, just to be more charitable. I want to assume that they think they have some knowledge that I am not privy to, not some feeling that I don't have, because part of having a belief is feeling that you have some knowledge the other person isn't privy to. And I want to assume that if I went through their beliefs, a more or less coherent model could be developed for their God belief. Even though I still wouldn't believe in it, it's important to be charitable, if only to make sure that counter-arguments are good. So let's steel-bot these motherfuckers like we're making Cybermen. To begin with, facts and feelings. The fact is, feelings are super important to facts. Emotion and feeling are important parts of human thought. We wouldn't be able to reason the way we do without them. One outcome of our reasoning skills is that you decide which facts to weigh more heavily. That's part of why we reason. And all reasoning is done from some emotional place. And if you deny that because you're a fucking rational boy, then you are wrong, and you are also probably bad at thinking. When things grab our attention, they tend to do so emotionally. Facebook and Twitter and Fox News aren't there to inform. They're there to elicit emotional responses. The things you're feeling right now, they may not be strong, but you're probably either having a knee-jerk reaction of happy bias agreeing with me, or angry dissonance because facts don't care about your feelings, logic and reason, rational boy. Both of those feelings are based in emotional reaction. So this is metacognition. And I've been doing that a lot recently, just thinking about thinking. The reason that I've been doing that is because I've been really dissatisfied with how people seem to think of reason or reasonableness, or think in general what logic and facts are. So I started probing that dissatisfaction. I started using my emotions to reason and find some conclusion as to why I was feeling that way. And part of that is rereading some Hume and reading some new Hume. So Rachel Cohen summarizes Hume a lot better than I could, and when it comes to reasoning and moral philosophy. So I'm going to quote from her Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy article, essay. I'm not sure what they're called. Article. I'm going to read from her SEPS article. Hume's position in ethics, which is based on his empiricist theory of the mind, is best known for asserting 4 theses. Reason alone cannot be a motive to the will, but rather is the slave of the passions. Moral distinctions are not derived from reason. Moral distinctions are derived from the moral sentiments, feelings of approval, esteem, praise, and disapproval, blame, felt by the spectators who contemplate a character trait or action. While some virtues and vices are natural, others, including justice, are artificial. End quote. So, what do we take away from Hume saying that reason is the slave of the passions? What does that mean? And really, I'm going to focus less on what Hume meant by that and more by what I think of when I think of that. And that involves going into what an emotion is. And I don't mean the teleology of it. I don't mean the end point or why it evolved or some big scale sweeping thing. I just mean how emotion is and was important in thinking and reasoning. So imagine that you're on the plains. You're in an area with kind of short grass. There's some trees in the distance. And near you is a patch of tall grass just blowing in the breeze, doing grass stuff. And there's some grass that looks a little thick. And the pattern is off. It's swaying weirdly. You notice it and you get a tinge of anxiety. Now, you're not sure if you should feel fear or anger yet. Are you going into fight or flee? Your body is increasing your heart rate and increasing your breathing, trying to get oxygen everywhere. You're getting more blood sent to your arms and your legs, used in fighting and fleeing. Now imagine you're at a stage in evolutionary development where we haven't developed our big, sexy prefrontal cortex to do our mental heavy lifting for us. And without that reasoning, what are you going to do? How are you going to figure out whether you should run without those higher reasoning processes to weigh options? Maybe you're going to feel some interest or curiosity, a dash of apprehensiveness. Maybe you're surprised. Mixing with anxiety, your blood goes to your muscles, but your eyebrows go up and your eyes open wide. It lets more light into your eyes so that you have more information you can process to try and figure out what's going on. Maybe the fact that humans have ears that wiggle isn't just a weird thing, and way back in the day, you would have tilted your ears to point it over there to see if you hear anything as part of that anxiety response. And your curiosity outweighs the rest of those. You inch closer. Your feelings of anxiety or curiosity slows you down because the strange grass patch where something seems hidden is something that you may not want to get closer to than you absolutely have to. If you have a rudimentary tool or a rock, maybe you lift it over your head to get ready to hit something. Now, translated to how we think of thinking and think of reasoning, that would seem like, what's there? Could be a predator, could be someone following me, could be my imagination. Let's look for clues. Let's gather information from which we can draw a definite or likely conclusion, and while I'm doing that, I will be careful not to upset or surprise the potential prey or predator that might hurt me or be useful for eating or other supplies. Now, that's very different than the kind of internal monologue that most people are used to. And it wouldn't really be super useful to think that slowly in that kind of situation. But the point is, what if you couldn't, though? What if you couldn't talk to yourself with words in that situation? Because that involves things like words or prefrontal cortex development that we may not have had yet. We may not have at that time been able to do that. As a matter of fact, there would have been a time where we were not able to do that. So when we imagine we have the emotion part of our brain, but not the cognition part yet, we can see a form of nonverbal information processing. It's talking to yourself without words. And this wouldn't be flawless, but I mean, even with higher reasoning, we're not exactly batting 100. So what are you going to do? The point is, there's no reason to think that emotions aren't a rudimentary form of cognition, a much faster, less nuanced brain that kicks on before we can wrap our heads around what we're reacting to and leads us by biases and dissonance and heuristics because it's not concerned with making sure we have good information, just processing the information we do have to come up with something to keep moving forward. So not only might it be that, yes, feelings do care about your reason and your logic, it could very well be the fact that that is what emotions are, is they were the precursor to reasoning and logic. They were just the kind of thoughts we could form before we could think. And that makes them very important to use in reasoning, because what that means is when we don't use them, we're ignoring a pretty substantive number of gears in our brain that is made for churning out reason and logic and everything else. So that is why I think Hume said the reason is slave to the passions. I don't think that he was talking about how we're led around by the nose by our emotions all the time, or saying that we can't reason outside of them, like it sort of sounded like the first time I heard that. Hume is saying, by my estimation, and this may just be me projecting what I want him to be saying on it, the blueprint for reasoning is the passions. Not that reasoning is subject to the passions, but the passions were the original cognition, and we can't ignore them when we do our reasoning because they're also a faster cognition. They're going to form the basis from which we reason. This isn't to say just fly by the pants of your emotional centers. This is to say that you have to recognize how your emotions influence the way you think about the world and the way you process the world. And you have to have a healthy relationship with them, and you have to do some metacognition to figure stuff out from time to time. And there's some thought that David Hume may have suffered from depression for a time in his life. And as someone who has dealt with depression my whole life, it seems really intuitive for me. When I react to something being depressed, or don't have motivation, or would rather just quit living instead of doing whatever the task is, I have to take that into consideration when I'm reasoning things out. It's not that I'm driven by my feelings. Like I said, we shouldn't be. It's that for whatever reason, being triggered, or just being after 10 o'clock at night, or I'm having a feeling that death is preferable to taking out the trash, or working on a podcast episode, or getting out of bed. And I have to deal with that. If I'm figuring out a puzzle and getting frustrated, if I'm driving and someone cuts me off, if I have a sandwich and I drop it, and then I'm sad. If I see a dog, literally any dog, and I get happy. These are all facts about how I interact with the state of the world. When I consider them, I have to consider the fact that is my feelings and how those facts interact. Otherwise, I'm not reasoning with all the information. If you don't pay attention to your feelings, and you don't involve them in your reasoning processes and have them interact with facts, you end up retreating into an empty shell of what could be a vibrant feeling person with a rich internal world. You end up screaming over Imagine until you're the antagonist that John Lennon didn't know he was singing to. You end up telling the world that your wife said a white vagina is a disease because you don't have the emotional maturity to just dig into why what bothers you so much, or the decency to be embarrassed when you do a William Shatner-esque spoken word version before bragging about your wife's appropriately dehumidified petticoat. Because you don't stop alongside your feelings about facts. And the facts about your feelings. And instead, you just dumbass your way through sounding like a massive toolbox because you can't admit you don't know things, or that the scaries give you the satty by times. Basically, this portion of the episode can be kind of summed up with Ben Shapiro will literally be Ben Shapiro instead of going to therapy. Back to the point. The argument that was trying to be made goes like this, and it has major William Lane Craig vibes. Although I recently got an email saying that he just did some in-depth study on the moral arguments, so it seems like he may have not been doing all the legwork at first, decades ago, when he started involving them in his arguments. But this also doesn't have quite the same level of tightness as you'd get from a professional philosopher, because it turns out spending years studying how to make arguments and what logic is and what arguments have been made and what arguments are helps you make better arguments. But the general vibe of what got vomited on me on the Bird site goes like this. If humans have value, then God is most likely real. If there are objective moral facts, then God is most likely real. If humans have value and access to objective moral facts, then God must have bestowed them. humans have value. There are objective moral facts humans have access to. Ergo, God is real. QED. You love Jesus now. Let's get a pint. And that's the closest I can get for making a valid argument out of the conversation that I'd had. Admittedly, Twitter isn't a great place for in-depth philosophical analysis of metaphysical ideas. It starts with a hypothetical that God is necessary condition for objective moral facts to exist. For humans to access those and also have value also requires God, and from the existence of those, God can be inferred into a conclusion. Bingo, bango, pop, God is real. I'm converted. We can all go home. Except that it's complete bullshit. I did my best to steel man it. That's all you can do. I wrote it and rewrote it, trying to make it a little less deductive, a little more inductive, but still reasoning to a place of deduction, and an additional necessary condition that makes it so that the first two possible necessary conditions must be the case. Okay, so you start with some condition and work your way to God. If this is the case, then God must be the case. If you remember the logic episode, I talked about this a little bit, and I'm going to talk about it more and more as time goes on, because broken record, why not? If I am wet, then it is raining is a bad argument. And the reason that it's a bad argument is because in order to follow it through, you have to say, if I am wet, then it is raining, and then I am wet, therefore it is raining. And that is formally, the math checks out on that. That is a formally valid argument, but it's a informally invalid argument. Stepping away from how the argument is structured and what the form is, there's any number of reasons why you could be wet if it isn't raining. It could be that you garden hose, right? You got sprayed with a garden hose, you walked through somebody's sprinklers, you had just gotten out of the shower, you fell into a pool. There's all kinds of reasons why a person could be wet. So framing it that way is a problem. And in a similar way, framing it so that if objective moral facts exist, then God must be real, is a serious problem, because it leads to logical issues like I'll be discussing a little later. Because hypotheticals go like this. If some sufficient condition is, then this necessary condition must have been met. And there's lots of ways to do that. I have phrased it as an if-then statement. It's very easy. You will frequently see things like, if such and such, then it must be the case that so-and-so. And what theists want to do is they want to come up with an argument that it's likely going to be inductive, where God is a necessary condition for some quality. Because if they can demonstrate that God is a necessary condition for some quality, then they can bring it to a logical conclusion that God is either most likely or definitely real. And that's the issue here. That's the logical issue there. When you get into the logic, boom. So the issue I attacked centers around whether or not it's necessary for humanity to have some external value bestower, if we have value at all as such. And religion serving that purpose is a whole episode in itself that I plan on getting into as a way to counter the idea that religion is mental illness. I would say humanity does not need or have an external value bestower, and actually ethics as an idea and field is a lot more useful that way. We have to think about how to treat each other and why we should care in the first place and what a good person looks like, and really internalize what these things are instead of just getting an instruction manual given to us by somebody who says, and you're worth $26.95. At least people should think about that, right? Some think about it more than others, and those people are called ethicists. And generally, if your quick way out is, well, there's this necessary condition that says that I have to do this because of thing, you're taking an easy way out. You're doing what Camus would call philosophical suicide. You're not reasoning. You're just checking out. I have the answers. It's in this book. I don't have to think about it. I don't have to reason. And that's pretty gross. If we say yes, that God exists to give us moral significance and knowledge, if we grant the necessary condition, there's issues we run into. The first is it just us that are morally significant? What species are morally significant, and do they have the same amount of special attention or value bestowedness that we have? And two, how do we know why what is good is good? I think the first is given an apparent answer from the Bible. The Bible study portions of the show aren't there yet, but some animals are more clean than others, and the clean ones are for eating. So if some animals are morally permissible as food, that means that they in some way have a value to be able to impact moral judgments. So are they more morally significant, or are they less morally significant? Can some animals, not counting humans for argument's sake, the evangelical anti-science Christians tend not to include humans as animals. They think we're some other kingdom of things, bacteria, I guess. But do some animals have the ability to get saved? Can they find redemption in Jesus? Do all dogs go to heaven? And if they aren't morally significant, what about animal abuse? Is that still wrong? Why make some more morally permissible as food? It seems pretty clear that we're morally responsible as much as we are if we abuse animals. So are the animals morally significant, or do we have some duty to non-morally significant animals? Is that an effect thing? Is God a consequentialist or not? If you have to have moral value for somebody to be able to behave unethically towards you, then it seems clear that either people who torture small animals are not doing anything morally wrong, or this is a bad proposition. So we need some way to gauge the moral significance insofar as the non-human things we do things to or with. Otherwise, it seems like whatever you're going to do is okay, as long as it isn't to a person, which is the argument presented to me about why atheist morality is bad. If this is the case, God's morality doesn't live up to my standards. It's also not true. There's all kinds of rules about non-human things, not the least of which is food and clothing and place laws and preparation for sacrifices for animals God particularly likes, which, if that's connected to moral value, gives sacrifice a weird general vibe. And if God changed those, like some Christians say, then they're not relevant anymore. But it seems like morality is dependent on God. So it's subjective to God, or is it objective and God just dictates? If it's objective and inconsistent, how do we know we have an accurate idea of what counts as morality in the theist model? Is God wrong and corrected himself, or is it arbitrary? That's a different issue. That's the Euthyphro dilemma, which is a common thing to have come up when you consider questions like this. The long version is that Socrates met this dude named Euthyphro at the courthouse because Mr. Euthyphro had killed a slave, and so Mr. Euthyphro, as my father, was going to go turn him in for murder because it's the pious thing to do. And so Socrates jumps on him with a bunch of questions, which leads to the short version. Is it good because God commands it, or does God command it because it's good? There's also some jumping around about how can we know that the gods know what objective morality is when there's more than one of them and they frequently disagree, which is relevant to Christianity because there does seem to be more than one God archetype in the Bible that frequently disagree. So that'll come up when it comes up. The point of the dilemma as applied to Christianity, though monotheistic Christianity, is that if God commands it because it's good, then God is actually irrelevant to the question because he isn't what makes goodness good. So it becomes a question of how does one determine what's good? If we grant that God is a person and therefore subject to being the part of the collective noun one, how does he know? He says it is, but is it some mechanism that we have access to? Is it just a God thing? Why wasn't that part of being created in God's image? We got being angry and vengeful and spiteful and lash out at people full, but we couldn't tell what is and isn't good? Or is it because God says so? And it runs into the same kind of arbitrary opinion-based bullshit that theists who don't care to read your responses or any moral philosophy at all like to say you reason from. Then there's that whole we reason from, at least in part, from emotion thing. So, and this is the one time I spoke of earlier, do they just feel it? Do they have some kind of sensor, real or imagined, that tells them? Do they think we all have one? If we all have one, why do we need God? If we don't, why not? And also, God is part of their reasoning. They reason using information from God. If you picture it like a river, with all of the things that go into how we filter information and what affects what facts we use and the premises that we use to arrive at conclusions, God is one of theirs. So they feel at some point that there is a God. And there's also a thing to be. What happens if God changes his mind? It's part of the censor thing, right? Let's say for a second that the Bible is morally consistent. We'll just take that as a premise. Remember when Lot's daughters raped him so that his line would continue, and then God was like, yeah, that's fine. And then later he was like, no incest. And that'll come up in Leviticus. The thing is, right, does it mean that incest is objectively bad and God had to play catch up? Or that incest became bad when God said so? My thought is that it's wrong as objectively as morality can be. And the reason for that is because we shouldn't have sexual relationships when the resulting offspring could be harmed through the genetic fermenting process. Through gestation, with a significantly higher than normal chance. And what I mean is harmed through gestation. It's got nothing to do with women. It's just the fact that people have to bake. And if you have genetics that cause you to be baked not according to recipe, then if that's things that are harmful, if things that are harmful can come up. I'm not talking about like just people who are, they're autistic and they have a full life and not that kind of thing. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about the kind of thing like spinal bifida, where your spine is growing outside of your body. Those kinds of genetic things. I think that chancing that, I think is wrong. So don't do an incest. It does raise issues of like, what if both people are sterile? What if they can't have kids? What if, for some reason, what if they both, get fixed? What if? And on that, I kind of have to bite the bullet and say, well, they're not having kids, but it still triggers a moral disgust response, So that's a different subject. It's a different, weirdly complicated subject. Here we're talking about whether or not God was wrong, and not implications of my moral views and the basis for them that leads to things that might need some thinking about on their own as thoughts. Develop those positions a little bit. Was it wrong? Was God wrong? Did God make it harmful? Did he not know it was harmful? It really puts a wrench in the gears no matter how you throw it. And this response, the Euthyphro thing, was from about the same time as the books in the Bible that we're reading. So it's contemporary to the writing of Genesis. There's also the claim that without God telling us what is good or deciding what is good for us, everything is permitted. And this is bullshit. If everything that was alive is worth one being unit, then we satisfy the worth idea anyway. But the more you apply it, the more gross that becomes. You are only moral if you have worth. Then it isn't objective. Making morality contingent on some arbitrary concept of value that nobody can quite define the rules for is fucking gross. If there are objective moral facts, then they're going to be linked to a lot of things. Most commonly seen in atheism and humanism tend to be harm and harm reduction. And I have an issue with some of that kind of, as far as having that as a basis for morality. And I think that we have to accept that moral responsibility and moral worth as being different from moral value are static when we make moral judgments. Otherwise, we end up just getting right back to the who is worth more game. And when you go there, things get bad 100% of the time. That's a bad starting place. And it gets worse every time. And this is a blanket statement. What is and is not moral being based on everyone being equal and that being a static quantity? One human is one human. One creature is one creature. One thing is one thing is an important basis for my ethics. I also end up with the same Euthyphro-based questions about whether we have value and so God is true. Can God take away our value? Is our value static? Or is it independent of God? He just clues us in. Can he confiscate it? How does that play into the ideas of hell? Is that hell? Do we have value because God says so? Or does God say so because we have value? So after pointing out that relying on God for ethical rules or for your life's values are both pretty sketchy, I want to run into a reminder that this is logic. And this is a logic, and then I want to continue running to what philosophers have to say about this. Or what one philosopher has to say about what philosophers have to say about this. I want to revisit and expound on the goals, the logical goals for arguments for God's existence. What are they trying to prove? Because they aren't trying to prove that God definitely exists. And that's part of why attacking the existence of God, while tempting and while generally fatal as a counter-argument when you're talking about people just out in the world who don't study this, it doesn't have the same impact with philosophers. What they're going for is an argument that will convince you to believe in God. Not because he's real, but because he's the most likely explanation you're going to get to a philosophical question like, are there valid commands or valid arguments for God's existence based in things most people know? Are there valid arguments for God's existence that most or some people would find more compelling than the counter-argument? And a reminder for people who think logic is just yelling out what the commonly named fallacies are, or making up your own in some cases that don't make any sense. I've seen some of that, and that's baffling. It really just makes it so that, like, people learning what logic is outside of, academia starts seeming like a mistake when people are like, we can't rely on what the dictionary says words are. That's a logical fallacy. It's an appeal to authority, and it's an appeal to expertise, which is valid. It's written by lexicographers and word dorks at institutions of higher education. That's like saying that relying on Carl Sagan for astrophysics is an appeal to physicists fallacy. It doesn't make any sense. So sorry, I keep getting distracted this episode. A valid argument doesn't have to be true. Valid just means that if all of the premises are true, the conclusion has to be true. An invalid argument is not when you can name the fallacy. It's when there are situations such that when the premises are true, the conclusion is not true. If all gleeps are borks, and there are gleeps, then they are borks. That is a valid argument. It's also nonsense, so it's not a sound argument unless there is some class of thing that I'm creating called gleeps and borks. But it is a valid argument because validity does not care about truth. Soundness cares about truth. And it does have to be pointed out again and again forever. It doesn't have to be one of the named forms, and the named fallacies aren't the only fallacies. The reason those have names is just because they're common ways to argue. When you look at propositional calculus, it is calculus, it's math. The number of ways there are to do the math, or fuck it up, are as many ways as there are to put statements together well or badly, or do math, or fuck up doing math. There may not actually be an upward limit to that. Finding out that kind of thing is why logicians study different kind of logic, and why that is a math class taught by the philosophy department. And we're here for philosophy, not for me getting on another anti-rational boy soapbox. But I'm going to keep doing that sporadically throughout my podcasting career.
Although I probably won't end on it with the to be continued all the time. That's probably just a this episode thing because I'm already at 40 minutes and I try to stay to a half hour. So I am going to take the lazy way out and use the rest of the recorded audio for the next episode so I can keep the ball rolling on new content. I didn't script anything for this episode. I don't know if you can tell from how I'm talking. I've been Phineas 12 Gauge. This has been the Apostate Seminary. The website is no, it hasn't. This has been the Apostate's Playground. The Apostate Seminary was the old name. This has been the Apostate's Playground. The apostatesplayground.com is ye olde website. The Twitter for me is the letter X Essential Panda. And the Twitter for the show is at Apostasy Powered. There is a Patreon and whatnot in the support section on the website. You should go there and give us some traffic. Otherwise, I don't even know why I made a website. So I will talk into your ear hole again in a fortnight. Don't be a rational boy. Go to therapy instead of being Ben Shapiro.